Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. When I purchased my cozy little bungalow on Elm Street last spring, I thought I was finally living the dream. After years of renting cramped apartments in the city, I had scrimped and saved enough for a down payment on my very own home. Sure, it was a fixer-upper that needed some TLC, but with my green thumb and HGTV obsession, I was determined to turn it into a Pinterest-worthy oasis. Located at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, the house boasted a sprawling front lawn and detached garage perfect for gardening projects. The previous owners had even installed a long winding driveway leading from the street back to the garage. I pictured myself pulling in after a long day of work, breathing a sigh of relief to be home. That vision of suburban bliss was shattered one sunny afternoon as I navigated my Kia Soul around the bend. There, sitting squarely in the middle of my driveway, was a police cruiser. Confused, I parked on the street and approached the vehicle cautiously. Inside sat Officer Jones, a stout officer I recognized from around town. "Excuse me, what seems to be the problem here?" I asked politely. "No problem, ma'am, just running radar to catch speeders," Jones replied in a bored tone. I surveyed the surroundings. We were the only two on this sleepy street, no speeders in sight. "Be that as it may, you are blocking my driveway. I need to park in my garage," I stated calmly. Jones exhaled loudly, clearly annoyed at having his radar trap session interrupted. "Yeah, okay, I'll move in a minute," he huffed. I waited impatiently as he took his sweet time pulling out and moving down the street. Over the next few weeks, this scene repeated itself. Jones parked randomly across my driveway at all hours, forcing me to park on the street. Each time I asked him to move, he grew more impatient. "With all due respect, officer, this is private property. You can't just use my driveway as your own personal parking spot," I asserted one day. "Listen, lady, I can park where I need to for police work. Don't cause problems," Jones fired back. I decided to take formal action. Printing out a cordial but firm notice, I left it under Jones's windshield wiper. "Dear Officer Jones, while I appreciate the hard work of our police force, I must ask that you refrain from blocking my driveway at 123 Elm Street going forward. This is private property, and it is not appropriate for you to obstruct my access. Thank you for your understanding." I hoped this would solve the matter, but instead it seemed to make Jones even more intent on tormenting me. The very next day after my notice, I arrived home to find his patrol car parked perfectly across the entire width of my driveway. I couldn't even begin to maneuver around it. Furious, I marched up to his window and rapped loudly. As the glass slid down, I was met with a smug grin. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" Jones asked with faux concern. "Yes, as I believe I made clear in my notice, you cannot block my driveway like this," I seethed. "As I believe I made clear, I can park where I need to for police work," he retorted. "What police work? You're just sitting here as you have been for weeks," I cried in exasperation. Jones leaned out his window menacingly. "Listen here, I don't have to explain myself to you. As a cop, I can go anywhere I please. Now move your car off the street or you'll be getting a ticket for obstruction, got it?" My hands trembled and face burned hot. I could not believe this abuse of power happening on my own property. But Jones had all the leverage. Reluctantly, I shuffled back to my Kia and drove off fuming. Over the next few days, I agonized over what to do. I felt violated and unsafe in my own home, but Jones clearly felt he could harass me with impunity. After talking it through with several trusted friends, I decided to fight fire with fire. The next time Jones trespassed on my driveway, I would photograph his car and badge number to document the misconduct. Then I would file an official complaint with his supervisor at the police department. Sure enough, that Saturday I emerged to find Jones predictably parked on my property once again. Pulling out my smartphone, I photographed his cruiser from multiple angles, making sure the badge number was clearly visible. As I snapped pictures, Jones suddenly noticed me. His face contorted in anger, and he came barreling toward me. Without warning, he slapped the phone violently from my hands. It crashed to the concrete below, screen shattering instantly. "What do you think you're doing?" Jones thundered, cornering me against the side of the house. "Who do you think you are, trying to get pictures of me?" I cowered in fear as the incensed cop towered over me. "I am sick and tired of your whiny complaints," he continued. "I will park wherever I damn well please. And if I see you outside taking photos again, I'll have you arrested for harassment of a police officer. Do you understand me?" I shook my head meekly, hot tears stinging my eyes. Satisfied with intimidating me into submission, Jones stomped back to his cruiser and sped off down the street. Still trembling from the traumatic encounter, I immediately phoned the police station to report the incident. The supervisor was deeply troubled by my account of Jones's aggression and violence. He assured me there would be a full investigation into misconduct. I also filed a formal complaint and contacted my lawyer to discuss options for recourse. Over the next few weeks, an internal review was conducted using footage from Jones's body cam. My lawyer helped me file a restraining order against him and a lawsuit against the department for damages. Finally, I received the call I had been waiting for. Jones was fired from the force for abuse of power, assault, destruction of property, and gross misconduct. The police chief himself called to personally apologize for how poorly the situation was handled. Their insurance agreed to fully cover the cost of my new phone, plus additional funds for emotional distress. Relieved that my driveway was finally free from that bullying entitled cop, I once again looked forward to arriving home each day. I was shocked how someone meant to protect and serve could so severely betray public trust and terrorize innocent citizens. But in the end, I found justice by standing up for myself against that corrupt, threatening authoritarian. My home is my sanctuary, not his personal parking lot. The next one is a pro-revenge story. I used to work at a medium-sized IT services company and had recently been moved to a smaller branch office with a nice pay raise. I was basically my own team and got to do interesting work on a large project. Since they were satisfied with the work but needed it done on a larger scale, the company hired another person to help me. Meet Fred. I knew Fred from outside work through common relationships, and I didn't find him any weirder than other nerdy people in the business. Oh boy, Fred was good at technical work. Very good. When it came to human interactions, though, it was something else. Fred thought of me as his only friend in the workplace, and would complain all day long about all other colleagues, who were all equally incompetent, weird, evil, and generally deserving of his scorn. Fred had a terrible tendency of telling other people we had to work with that they were doing things wrong and that their software was crap. Which was often technically right, but he completely forgot the constraints in which other people had to work and that there might have been reasons for things that now sounded awful, which is basically always the case in IT. People resented both of us as a team for things he said, and some situations became entrenched. It was getting harder every day for me to get to work. Eventually, he made a lot of enemies, and he got a meeting with the division director. It only lasted for a few minutes, during which he told the boss of 800 people that he was an evildoer. It was his last day in the company. I worked alone from that time and managed to finish most of the project, smoothing things over with other teams. A few months later, I got an offer for the job of my dreams in a huge utility company. After starting the work, guess who I discovered working right here as a contractor under my direct supervision? Fred. Fred looked so happy to find a friend again. He spent most of my first day at work telling me how the company was awful, everyone was dumb, and everything was insufferable. I went home that night feeling horrible, wondering how much of what he told me was true and how bad it would be to work there. Turns out, after a few hard starting days, it really was the job of my dreams. Acting now with Fred as a client and not a colleague, I managed to keep him in check and improve the perceived quality of the team's work a lot. Prior to my hiring, Fred was basically telling people to leave whenever they asked him things he didn't want to work on. Having someone who could see through his nonsense to manage him got the roadmap back on track. Eventually, I learned that my colleagues had been very wary about working with me at the beginning because Fred had been bad-mouthing me from the day he learned I had been hired to manage him. This made the first weeks difficult until they understood he had been lying about it all. About 2 years later, I was now the team manager, and my boss came into my office and asked me about a hiring issue. There was a new position in the team, and the recruiter asked him about someone with excellent technical skills but who sounded very arrogant. Guess who wanted to work as my colleague again? If you followed the story, you've got it right. I did not let on to my boss the slightest bit of resentment. I explained to him how he was a very competent person, but that he might just lack some of the skills required for our company's teamwork. I knew exactly what I had to say for my boss to never want to hire him, ever, without making it about our personal history. I only told what happened to a close coworker, and he sounded very thankful to hear that he would not have to work with Fred as a colleague. A few months later, his company lost the contract and Fred was hired by the new contractor. However, they were not as lenient with him as the previous company was, and a few months later, I was finally Fred free. Last I heard of him, he was working at a Silicon Valley giant on a project that was in a worldwide media crapstorm over technical issues. I keep wondering whether he was telling everyone else in his team how bad they were at their jobs and how much he contributed to that massive failure. The next one is a petty revenge story. Backstory: I, 22M, have a twin sister, Karen, 22F, who mostly cares about herself. We both recently graduated from college and still live at home, with her room right across the hall from mine. Her boyfriend John, 22M, stays over most weekends and is practically part of the family. However, she treats him poorly, constantly belittling and yelling at him over trivial matters. She is a teacher, while he does manual labor. On Saturday morning, I was woken up at 8 a.m. by Karen yelling at John. She wanted him to go to the gym with her, but he wanted to sleep. This happens almost every weekend. I told her to be quiet because I was trying to sleep, and I also asked her to leave him alone. Her response was that she didn't care that I was trying to sleep and that it was 8 a.m., implying that I should be up anyway. As a teacher on summer break, she doesn't need to catch up on sleep during the weekends. Karen ended up going to the gym without John, but not before she called him lazy, despite the fact that he does manual labor for a living. She also believes that her job is the hardest in the world, and that nobody could possibly understand its difficulty. I admit it's challenging, but she uses it to undermine the work that others do. Now, cue the revenge. It just so happens that our parents are leaving on vacation on Monday. This means that Karen and I will have to take care of our dog. Since I have to get up early for work, I have the morning duty and she has the night duty. Since our mom is an early riser, our dog needs to go out at 5 a.m. in the morning. I will have to wake up at that time for the next week. So guess who will also be awakened? Karen. And when she gets angry and yells at me to leave her room, I will remind her of all the things she said to me when I wanted to sleep. Sweet dreams. The next one is a malicious compliance story. Back when I was at school, the literature professor, let's call him Lit Professor, was a master of malicious compliance. He had a friendly rivalry with the dean. They had been working together for nearly 30 years, so they knew each other very well, and played pranks on each other as well. In class, the usual practice was that if someone knocked on the door, the student closest to the door would get up and open it. One time, the dean knocked when a lit professor was teaching. I got up to open the door, and the dean said, "I want him," pointing at Lit Professor, "to open the door." I looked at Lit Professor, and he said, "Okay, close the door and go sit back down." Then Lit Professor dropped to his knees and started crawling to the door, shouting, "We're sorry, oh great dean, we're not worthy of your presence. Please forgive us if we've done wrong." It took him perhaps 2 minutes to crawl the 2 meters to the door. We lost it. We were laughing our asses off. The dean stood there with a look that mixed bafflement and anger, but at the same time trying not to burst into laughter. The fact that the dean's reason for coming was the most standard, mundane, and generic announcement made it even funnier somehow. This was Lit Professor's typical behavior. He used to spend a lot of chalk writing on the board, almost twice as much as the next professor, so the person in charge of supplies complained, and the head of studies cut Lit Professor's chalk supply in half. So he would steal other professors' chalk to have the amount he thought he needed. He told this story about the first time he had to teach, almost 30 years before my time at the school. Bear in mind he was short, 1.55 m tall, bald with a mustache, and had to wear huge green-tinted glasses. He looked a little bit like Ernesto Sabato, a well-known Argentinian novelist. You can Google it if you want to form an image of how Lit Professor looked like. His first class ever was with the misfits of the school, a rowdy class. He stood up at the podium. They had podiums back then, and nobody even tried to listen to what he had to say. After 10 minutes, Lit Professor said, "Excuse me, guys. Do you want me to continue the class, or are you up to something more important?" One of the bullies told him to beat it, and everybody laughed. So he grabbed the newspaper, took a seat at his desk, and stayed there for the whole class without saying a word. When the bell that signaled the end of class rang, he got up and said, "Okay, tomorrow we'll have an exam, 1 of 3 for the semester. You need to have at least an average of 6 points to pass the semester. The exam will be about what I was supposed to teach today." Then he walked out of the room. We loved the guy. He was fair, he had a true passion for literature, he was a good professor, and he made the classes enjoyable and interesting. Now that I've established his usual behavior, let's go back to when I was at school. At the end of the first semester, L8 professor submitted the grades for each student to the head of studies. This story was told by the head of studies secretary, a former student who was a friend of many students there. The head of studies was the worst. He was more concerned about the school's image than about what the students really learned. He had quotas for the number of students who could pass and fail each class. Lit professor submitted a list for our class, mostly very good students, where 80% of the class passed with flying colors, 8S, 9S, and 10S out of 10, and just one guy scored below 6, which meant he failed the class. He was called to the head of studies office. The head of studies was angry, shouting that there were too few people failing and that LIT professor was being too generous with the grading system he used. LIT professor stood there and just listened. He said, "Okay," and left. Now comes the first malicious compliance. He submitted a new list. Every single student had a 2, which meant failure for the whole class. He got called to the head of studies office again. The head of studies was fuming, telling him that he didn't want this mockery, and demanded that LIT professor submit a new list with better grades. LIT professor said, "Okay," and left. And now, for the second malicious compliance, he submitted another new list. Every single student had a 10. He got called to the head of studies office again. The head of studies was pretty much having a heart attack. Before he could say anything, Lit professor said, "What, you didn't like the new list either? I'll tell you what, I know what each student deserves, so shut the duck up and let me do my work, okay?" He then produced the original list and walked out. The list got accepted. The next one is an entitled people story. I was just reminiscing about the absurdity of this situation that happened almost 2 years ago, and I've decided it's too good not to share. I'll be honest, it involves a lot of legal stuff that I'm not sure I'm talking about 100% correctly, but I can assure you this story is true, as is the end result. This might be a long one, so buckle up. For context, my mom is a traveling healthcare worker, not a nurse nor a doctor, just to clarify, and we're from the US. Usually, her contracts last from 8 weeks to 9 months, and she's worked all around the States. This results in an ungodly amount of airline miles that she likes to gift me so I can visit her wherever she's on contract. I get a nice vacation, she gets to see me, I get to see her. Win-win-win. 2 years ago, after I graduated and was living at my mom and her long-term boyfriend's house in a COVID lockdown-induced depression and existential crisis, my mother scored her first overseas contract on a tropical island for 6 months, from June to the end of November. I had gotten a crappy job in my hometown to start saving for whatever my next step was. 3 months in, my mom realized the downside of being on a very small island where international travel to and fro was a pain in the butt. She was lonely. This prompted a very bashful phone call in which she asked me if I wanted to take a break from working and come stay with her for a while. I jumped at the opportunity, and we made arrangements to get my passport renewed and booked a ticket for me to stay with her for the last few months of her contract. All of this context comes to the main character, another US-based traveler, also not a nurse nor a doctor, who was my mother's co-worker. Let's call her Mary. Mary, to put it bluntly, was racist as hell, and she was not enjoying getting paid to work on an island with crystal blue water and white sand beaches. Why? Because she failed to realize that she wouldn't be treating elite white resort goers. Note, it turns out the people who tend to be treated at the local hospital were the native islanders, the people of color. She was also a COVID denier, Trumper, and anti-vaxxer. Really just a blast to talk to, sarcasm. She was so livid about having to go to a grocery shop surrounded by PEC, not what she called them, hint. It starts with N and ends with R. It didn't matter that she could go to the beach every day after work and was lodged in a multi-million-dollar vacation home on one of the highest points of the island with a gorgeous view. Nah, she was too busy recoiling at the sight of gasp melanin. So yeah, she hated being there and wanted nothing more than to leave. She latched on to my mother for company, and my mother reluctantly obliged her for a time due to aforementioned loneliness. The main conflict of this story comes when my mother's contract began to reach its end while Mary still had a month to go. Mary fought tooth and nail to renegotiate an early end of her contract but was denied. So what does she do? She just leaves. Like, packs all her stuff and departs to the US anyway. No biggie, right? She just doesn't get her remaining paychecks? Wrong. Here comes the beauty of contracts. See, the contract she agreed to comp her lodging on the condition she fulfills her employment duties. Since she very clearly had no intention to, the contract was, therefore, voided, and the compensation for her lodging was promptly retracted. She was now on the hook to pay back this country's health ministry for the several months of rent they had paid to house her in that gorgeous vacation home with a beautiful view. I'm not sure how much it would have been, but I'm guessing $1 million at the very least. Mary was now not only a crap employee in this country, but a literal fugitive. But she figured they could only arrest and charge her if she ever stepped foot back on their soil, so she wasn't concerned. She was mostly right, but that wasn't the only thing this country's government could do. They proceeded to ring up the good old US government, notify them of the charges, and let them take it from there. They couldn't have her extradited, but they could ask the US to flag her passport until she paid them or faced charges, so the US government said, "Sure, buddy, we'll do it." And they did. Mary can't leave the US anymore. She can't even go to Canada. She tried to join her friends on vacation in Mexico, but wouldn't be allowed to cross the border. So if you ever think you screwed up a job really badly, just remember that you, at least, aren't an actual international criminal who can no longer leave the country. I'm not sure why her racist butt even wanted to go to Mexico. I heard there are a lot of Mexican people there. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already.